Shadows of injustice. The afternoon sun hung low in the autumn sky, casting golden light across the cracked sidewalks of Everdale, a small city with a complicated history. For some, it was a place of opportunity. For others, it was a reminder of the injustices that still lurked beneath its polished surface. Melaine Carter, a 72-year-old woman bound to a wheelchair, navigated the uneven pavement with careful precision. Her hands, worn with age and wisdom, guided the wheels steadily as she made her way home from the bank. She carried a sense of pride in her independence. Though she had a son who could help, Julian Carter, a prominent attorney, she preferred to handle her affairs herself. She had spent her entire life fighting to prove that her disability did not define her, and she wasn't about to start relying on others now. She clutched her handbag in her lap, inside which was the small deposit she had just made. A routine transaction, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her as she moved down the empty street. As she neared a quiet intersection, the sound of heavy boots against concrete made her pause. Two uniformed officers emerged from a side street, their strides purposeful, their eyes locked onto her. "Hey, you," one of them barked. Melaine stopped her wheelchair and looked up. The officer who had spoken was tall, with sharp features and a clean-shaven head. His partner, a stockier man with a thick mustache, stood slightly behind him, arms crossed. Melaine, ever composed, replied calmly, "Yes, officer." "Is there a problem?" The taller cop stepped closer, his shadow stretching over her. "We need to see your ID." Melaine frowned. She had done nothing suspicious, and she certainly wasn't accustomed to being stopped on her way home. But she knew better than to argue. With a measured sigh, she reached into her handbag, her fingers trembling slightly as she retrieved her identification. The tall officer snatched it from her hands and examined it with narrowed eyes. His lips curled downward. "This ID looks fake." Melaine's heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me," she said, disbelief laced in her voice. "That ID is real. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years. The stocky officer let out a low chuckle, his amusement sending a chill down her spine. "You sure about that?" he asked, tilting his head. "You don't seem like the type who belongs around here." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had heard variations of this sentiment her entire life. Disbelief in her place, her worth, her right to exist in certain spaces. But hearing it from the very people who were supposed to protect the public made her stomach turn. "I just came from the bank," she said, keeping her voice firm. "I live just a few blocks away." The tall officer scoffed. "Sure you do," he muttered sarcastically, before handing the ID back to his partner. The stocky officer took a step forward, now looming over her. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. Melaine tightened her grip on the bag in her lap. "Just my personal belongings," she said carefully. "We'll see about that," the tall officer replied before snatching the bag from her lap. Melaine gasped, her body tensing as she watched them rifle through her possessions. Her hands clenched the arms of her wheelchair in frustration, but she willed herself to stay calm. "This is illegal," she said through gritted teeth. "You have no right to search my bag without cause." The stocky officer laughed. "Cause? We don't need cause when we have suspicion. And we're very suspicious of you," the taller officer added, tossing the bag onto the ground. Melaine had spent her entire life advocating for justice, teaching her son the importance of integrity, fighting against discrimination. And now, here she was, reduced to nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of these men. "You're coming with us," the tall officer said suddenly, grabbing the handles of her wheelchair. Melaine's breath caught in her throat. "What? On what grounds?" she protested, gripping the armrests tightly. "You're under arrest," the stocky officer sneered. "For what?" she demanded. "For resisting," the tall officer replied. Melaine's stomach twisted. Resisting. She hadn't resisted anything. She had complied. She had remained calm. And yet they were still treating her as if she were a criminal. The taller officer's grip tightened on her wheelchair as he began pushing it toward the squad car parked at the end of the street. Panic surged through her. "Stop," she shouted, trying to pull back against the force. "Let go of me." But the officers ignored her. As they neared the car, the stocky officer suddenly shoved her forward, knocking the wheelchair off balance. Maylene cried out as she felt herself tip over, her frail body tumbling onto the hard pavement. Pain shot through her arms and legs as she landed, her cheek scraping against the rough ground. "Stay down," the stocky officer barked, his voice void of concern. Maylene groaned, struggling to push herself up, but before she could, she felt a boot press against her shoulder, keeping her down. "You shouldn't have resisted," the tall officer muttered. Tears of pain and rage welled in Maylene's eyes. She had never felt so powerless. And then, just as her world was spinning into chaos, she heard a voice from a distance. A voice she knew well. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The officers turned, their expressions shifting as they recognized the man storming toward them. Julian, Maylene's son, a man they never wanted to cross. Julian Carter wasn't just any man. He was a fighter, a legal powerhouse, and the very last person they ever wanted to see in this situation. And as he closed the distance between them, his rage was palpable. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The fire within. Julian Carter's heart pounded like a war drum as he stormed toward the scene unfolding before him. He had just parked his car 2 blocks away when he noticed the disturbance. It had started as a murmur in the distance, a low hum of unrest, voices raised in anger and confusion. But as he drew closer, his trained legal mind picked up on the unmistakable signs of injustice playing out before his very eyes. And then he saw her. His mother, Maylene Carter, was sprawled on the pavement, her wheelchair overturned a few feet away. Her frail frame was crumpled beneath the weight of age and pain, her hands trembling as she struggled to lift herself. The sight sent a jolt of fury through him, igniting a fire that had been smoldering beneath his composed surface for years. This was the woman who had raised him, who had taught him right from wrong, who had given him everything despite the hardships she had endured. And now she lay helpless on the cold pavement, while 2 uniformed officers loomed over her like vultures. The taller officer, the one who had pushed her, sneered down at her as if she were nothing. His partner stood beside him, his stance rigid, his eyes scanning the growing crowd, assessing whether their authority was at risk. But they hadn't yet realized the real danger standing right in front of them. Julian's voice sliced through the tense atmosphere like a blade through silk. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His steps were quick and full of purpose, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the vicinity. The crowd shifted, parting just enough for him to step into the circle of confrontation. The tall officer straightened his posture, his expression hardening as he turned to face Julian. "Step back, sir. This is police business." Julian didn't slow. He didn't waver. He didn't flinch. "Police business," he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. His dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, burned with controlled rage as they flicked from one officer to the other. "Is that what you call assaulting an elderly disabled woman? You think your badge gives you the right to treat people like this?" The stocky officer scoffed. She was resisting arrest. Julian let out a dry, humorless laugh. Resisting arrest. A 72-year-old woman in a wheelchair. That's your story. His gaze fell to his mother, and for a split second, his hardened exterior cracked, revealing the anguish beneath. Maylene, his strong, unshakable mother, was barely able to move. Bruises were already forming along her cheek where one of them had struck her. Blood was smeared across her bottom lip. His breath hitched, but he forced himself to focus. There would be time for grief later. Right now, he needed to be the lawyer, the protector, the son his mother had raised him to be. He turned back to the officers, his voice cold, measured. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to step away from my mother. You're going to put your hands where I can see them. And you're going to pray to whatever gods you believe in that I don't take this to court and rip your entire department apart." The tall officer's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing at his side as if resisting the urge to reach for his baton. The stocky officer, however, took a bold step forward. "You interfering in an arrest, Mr. Attorney Julian Carter." His name landed like a hammer. A ripple went through the crowd. They had all heard of Julian Carter, the tenacious defense attorney, the civil rights advocate, the man who had made his career exposing corruption within the justice system. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a force of nature, a nightmare for men like them. The stocky officer's confidence faltered, but he doubled down. "I don't care who you are. This is a lawful detainment." Julian's lips curled into a sharp smile. "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, I see multiple violations: illegal search and seizure, unlawful detainment, excessive use of force, violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Shall I continue?" The officers hesitated, but Julian wasn't finished. He took another step forward, his body a wall between them and his mother. "Oh, and let's not forget the part where you assaulted her in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, while multiple phones recorded every second of it." The crowd, now emboldened, murmured in agreement. Several people raised their phones higher, ensuring the cameras captured every moment. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The stocky one swallowed hard, clearly regretting his choices. Julian's voice dropped lower, a blade wrapped in velvet. "You both should start thinking about your pensions, because by the time I'm done with you, neither of you will ever work in law enforcement again." The tall officer clenched his jaw. "You can't threaten us." Julian tilted his head slightly. "Threat? No, officer. This is a promise." A tense silence settled over the scene. The officers were now keenly aware that they had underestimated the situation. They had expected another helpless victim, another nobody who would bow beneath their authority. What they had found instead was their worst nightmare: an educated, relentless man with the law on his side and the public watching. Then the wail of sirens split through the tension. More police vehicles pulled up, and from them stepped several officers, including a commanding officer with a hardened expression. The tall officer, suddenly less confident, took a step back as his superior approached. "What's going on here?" the commanding officer demanded. His sharp eyes swept over the scene, taking in the overturned wheelchair, the crowd, and most damningly, the bruised and bleeding woman on the ground. Julian squared his shoulders, his voice steady. "What's going on, Captain, is that these two officers assaulted my mother. They unlawfully detained her, used excessive force, and physically harmed her without provocation." The captain's gaze darkened. He turned to the two officers, his voice clipped. "Is this true?" The tall officer hesitated. The stocky one shifted on his feet, his confidence all but gone. She was resisting. "Bullshit," Julian cut him off without hesitation. "I have witnesses. I have video evidence. And I have a mother who can barely move because of what they did. So tell me, Captain, what are you going to do about it?" The captain's jaw worked as he assessed the situation. He could already feel the weight of public scrutiny pressing in on him. With all the cameras, the crowd, and Julian Carter standing there like a storm waiting to break, there was no brushing this under the rug. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "You two, step back. Hand over your badges and guns. Internal Affairs will handle this." The stocky officer turned red with rage. "Captain, that's an order." The two officers hesitated, but under the commanding officer's gaze and the dozens of eyes recording their downfall, they had no choice. Slowly, reluctantly, they unhooked their badges and handed them over. The crowd erupted in cheers. People clapped, whistled, and shouted their approval. Julian felt a brief flicker of satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by the deeper, heavier weight of reality. This wasn't over. His mother had been hurt. His mother had been brutalized. And even though these officers were now suspended, there was an entire system that allowed this to happen in the first place. He turned to his mother, kneeling beside her as paramedics arrived. He took her trembling hand in his, squeezing gently. "It's okay, Mom. You're safe now." Melene's lips quivered, her voice weak but firm. "I knew you'd come." Julian swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. Always. But even as he said it, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The battle begins. The cold fluorescent lights in Everdale Memorial Hospital cast a sterile glow over the emergency room as Julian sat beside his mother's bed, his fists clenched on his lap. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking the heavy silence between them. He could see the bruises forming along her cheek, deep purple blooming over delicate, weathered skin. A thin line of dried blood trailed from the corner of her lip, a painful reminder of the officer's brutality. Even in her weakened state, Melene Carter radiated the quiet strength that had carried her through decades of struggle. Julian had seen countless victims of police violence in his career, had fought for justice on behalf of people who had suffered under the very system meant to protect them. But this was different. This was personal. His mother had been targeted, humiliated, and brutalized, and every fiber of his being burned with the need to make those responsible pay. "I should have been there," he muttered, his voice hoarse with restrained fury. His hands curled into fists, nails digging into his palms as he stared at the bruises on her face. "I should have." "Stop that." Melene's voice was soft but firm, a mother's voice, even now. She turned her head slightly to look at him, the IV taped to her frail arm shifting with the movement. "You were there when it mattered, Julian." He inhaled sharply, shaking his head. "It shouldn't have happened at all, Mom. None of this should have happened. They treated you like—" He clenched his jaw, swallowing back the anger threatening to consume him. "Like you weren't even human." Melene sighed, reaching for his hand with her own, her fingers weak but warm. "This isn't the first time I've seen hate in a man's eyes. And it won't be the last." Julian met her gaze, his eyes stormy. "No, it will be the last. I'm going to make sure of it." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Julian turned to see Dr. Patel, his mother's primary physician, entering with a clipboard in hand. She was a petite woman with a calm, reassuring presence, her expression carefully neutral as she glanced at Melene's vitals. "She's stable," Dr. Patel said, offering a small nod. "No fractures, but there's some internal bruising and mild trauma to her ribs. We're keeping her overnight for observation, but she should be able to go home tomorrow." Julian exhaled sharply, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Doctor." Dr. Patel hesitated for a moment before adding, "The police have been trying to reach you, Julian. They've left several messages at the nurse's station." Julian's eyes darkened, his spine straightening. "I'll deal with them on my terms." Dr. Patel nodded, seeming to understand that there was more at play here than a routine legal matter. She left quietly, giving them privacy once more. Melene sighed as she watched her son, her sharp gaze reading him as easily as she always had. "You're going to war, aren't you?" Julian didn't hesitate. "Yes. And I'm not backing down." By the time Julian arrived at his office later that evening, his legal team was already waiting. His assistant, Camille, stood by the doorway, her phone in one hand and a tablet in the other, her expression tense but focused. Inside the conference room, 3 of his best attorneys were reviewing case files and watching the viral videos of his mother's assault. The footage, captured from multiple angles by bystanders, had already spread across social media like wildfire. Camille barely looked up as she said, "The mayor's office has called twice. The police commissioner wants a meeting, and 3 different civil rights groups have reached out offering support." Julian nodded, dropping his coat over a chair and rolling up his sleeves. "Good, because we're about to take this fight to every courtroom, every press conference, and every legal avenue available to us." One of his senior attorneys, Marcus Reed, leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "We've got them, Julian. The footage is damning. Even if they try to spin it, there's no denying what happened. They assaulted an elderly woman without cause, used excessive force, and violated multiple constitutional rights. This is more than just a civil lawsuit. We can push for criminal charges." Julian's expression hardened. "That's exactly what we're going to do." Camille's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen before handing it to Julian. "It's the commissioner." Julian took the phone but didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let it ring as he turned back to his team. "I want every angle covered. We're not just suing those two officers. We're going after the department, the leadership that enabled this, the policies that allow officers to act with impunity. This isn't just about my mother. This is about every single person who has been a victim of police brutality." His team nodded in agreement, determination burning in their eyes. Finally, Julian answered the call. "Commissioner Dalton," he said coolly. There was a pause before the commissioner spoke. His voice was measured, but there was an underlying edge of unease. "Julian, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." Julian's jaw tightened. "Bigger than it needs to be. Your officers assaulted my 72-year-old mother in broad daylight. What exactly do you think the appropriate size for this situation is, Commissioner?" A sigh crackled through the line. "Look, we both know how these things play out. The department is already taking action. The officers have been suspended. Suspended isn't enough." Julian's voice was steel. "They need to be prosecuted, and your entire department needs to answer for the culture that allowed this to happen." Dalton's voice dropped into a warning tone. "Julian, you're a smart man. You know that pushing this too far could have consequences." Julian's grip on the phone tightened. "Consequences? You want to talk about consequences? Let me be clear. If justice isn't served, I will make sure every single person responsible for covering this up is exposed. I will take this to federal court if I have to. I will not stop until my mother gets the justice she deserves." Another pause. Then, a resigned sigh. "I'll set up a meeting with the mayor's office tomorrow." Julian's voice was ice. "Good. Because if I don't see real accountability, I will bury your department in lawsuits and media coverage until there is nothing left of your reputation but ashes." He ended the call without waiting for a reply. The room was silent for a moment before Camille exhaled sharply. "Well, that was intense." Julian turned back to his team, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow, we go to war." And as he sat down at the table, the weight of his mother's pain sitting heavy in his chest, he made himself a promise. This fight wasn't just about her. This was about change. And he would see it through to the very end. The fight for justice. The following morning, Julian Carter stood in front of the mayor's office, a storm brewing in his chest. The building loomed before him, an architectural testament to power and control. But today, he would not be the one controlled. Today, he was here not just as a son seeking justice for his mother, but as an advocate for every victim of police brutality. The events of the previous day had left a fire burning inside him, one that could not be extinguished with empty promises or weak apologies. The night had been restless, his mind racing with strategies and legal maneuvers. The case against the two officers who assaulted his mother was airtight, but Julian knew better than to assume justice would simply unfold on its own. He had spent his career watching the system protect its own, bending the truth to suit its narrative, sacrificing victims on the altar of public relations and political maneuvering. That would not happen this time. Not with his mother. Not while he was breathing. As he stepped inside the grand lobby, his sharp brown eyes swept over the marble floors and pristine white walls, a stark contrast to the corruption festering beneath. Camille walked beside him, her heels clicking against the polished tiles. Dressed in her signature navy suit, she was the perfect picture of efficiency, her phone in one hand and a folder in the other. "The media is already waiting outside," she murmured, scanning through emails on her tablet. "Reporters from every major network. Your statement from last night went viral. #JusticeForMaline is trending. There's even talk of a citywide protest." Julian exhaled slowly. "Good. Let them feel the pressure. A young assistant greeted them at the reception desk and led them to the mayor's conference room. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Seated at the long wooden table was Mayor Richard Langston, a man known more for his political survival skills than for any real commitment to justice. Beside him sat Commissioner Dalton, his face lined with irritation, his hands folded on the table as if preparing for battle. A few other officials were present, each with carefully neutral expressions, but Julian could see the discomfort in their eyes. They knew this meeting was about damage control. Julian took his seat, his posture upright, his face unreadable. Camille sat beside him, ready to take notes, while Marcus Reed, one of his senior attorneys, settled in across from them. Langston cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, let me start by saying how deeply sorry we are for what happened to your mother. This is an unfortunate incident." Julian held up a hand, his jaw tightening. "Stop right there." His voice was calm but razor-sharp, slicing through the mayor's rehearsed condolences. "Don't insult my intelligence by calling this an unfortunate incident. This was an act of brutality. My mother was targeted, harassed, and assaulted by officers who believed they could get away with it." Langston shifted uncomfortably. "We understand your frustration." "You don't understand anything," Julian cut in, his tone unwavering. "If you did, you wouldn't be sitting here trying to downplay it. Two uniformed men used their authority to brutalize a 72-year-old disabled woman in broad daylight. This is not a misunderstanding. It's a crime." Dalton finally spoke, his voice laced with forced patience. "We are conducting an internal review. The officers have been placed on administrative leave pending the results of the investigation." Julian leaned forward, his gaze locking onto the commissioners. "Administrative leave." He let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "That's your response. They get a paid vacation while my mother recovers in a hospital bed." His voice dropped, slow and deliberate. "No, that's not going to cut it." Langston interjected, his tone placating. "What do you propose, Mr. Carter?" Julian's eyes darkened. "First, those two officers need to be arrested, not suspended, not reassigned. Arrested. Second, this department needs to take full responsibility for fostering a culture that allows this kind of abuse. And third, we will be filing a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city." Dalton's face turned red. "That's excessive." Julian's expression didn't waver. "No. What's excessive is the amount of unchecked brutality happening in this city. What's excessive is my mother being thrown to the ground like she was nothing. What's excessive is you sitting here acting like this isn't your problem." Langston sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Look, Julian, you're a respected attorney, and we don't want this to escalate. We're willing to discuss a settlement." Julian's fist clenched on the table. "You think this is about money?" His voice was deadly quiet, sending a chill through the room. "This isn't about a payout. This is about accountability." He exhaled slowly, controlling the fury simmering beneath his skin. "And let me be very clear. If this city does not take immediate action, I will take this case to the Department of Justice. I will make sure this investigation goes beyond just these two officers. I will uncover every corrupt policy, every abuse of power, every cover-up in this department. And when I'm done, the whole damn city will know exactly what kind of system you're running." Dalton bristled. "You're making threats, Carter." Julian's eyes burned with intensity. "No, I'm making a promise." The silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, Langston leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the table. He could see the writing on the wall. This wasn't going away. The media was already involved, and Julian Carter wasn't just some grieving son looking for justice. He was a force of nature, and he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Langston exhaled heavily. "I'll speak with the district attorney. If the evidence is as strong as you say, we'll move forward with charges against the officers." Julian nodded once. "That's a start." Dalton glared at him, but he didn't argue. He knew the pressure was mounting. The public was watching. And Julian Carter had just made it clear he wasn't backing down. As Julian stood to leave, he paused at the door, his voice carrying a final warning. "Do the right thing now, or I'll make sure you're all held accountable." Then he walked out, Camille and Marcus following close behind. As soon as they stepped outside, a flood of reporters swarmed them, microphones and cameras thrust forward, questions fired from every direction. Julian took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and faced the cameras head-on. "The city of Everdale has a choice to make," he said, his voice steady, his presence unshakable. "They can either stand for justice, or they can stand for corruption. My mother was brutalized by the very people sworn to protect her. But she is not just my mother. She is a symbol of every person who has suffered under police brutality. And I promise you, this fight is far from over." The cameras flashed. The crowd murmured. And in that moment, Julian knew this wasn't just about his mother anymore. This was a movement. And he would see it through to the very end. The war in the courtroom. The courtroom was packed. The air buzzed with tension, thick with the weight of what was at stake. On one side sat the two officers, now former officers, their uniforms traded for dark suits that did little to mask their discomfort. Their legal team sat beside them, stiff-backed and unreadable, a well-funded defense prepared to fight for their survival. On the other side, Julian Carter sat with unwavering composure, his sharp suit a stark contrast to the burning fury behind his eyes. His mother was not in attendance. Melaine Carter was still recovering at home, though her absence did nothing to weaken the gravity of the case. She was here in spirit, in every piece of evidence, in every moment of brutality captured on video and played before the court. The judge, a stern woman in her late 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, called the court to order. The murmurs from the gathered spectators, community members, activists, reporters, died down, replaced by an eerie silence. This was not just another case. This was history in the making. Julian rose, buttoning his suit jacket, and stepped toward the jury. His gaze, steady and piercing, swept over them, ensuring he had their full attention. Then, with a deep breath, he began. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today because two men who swore an oath to protect and serve, used their power not to uphold justice, but to violate it." He turned, pacing slowly, his voice measured and strong. "These two officers did not stop my mother because she was breaking the law. They did not detain her because she was a threat. They targeted her because she was vulnerable, because she was an easy mark for their abuse of power." He gestured toward the screen where the now infamous video had been paused, frozen on the frame where the officers had thrown Melaine to the pavement. The image was stark, undeniable. This was not an arrest. This was an assault. The defense attorney, a middle-aged man with a slicked-back haircut and the kind of arrogance that came with years of defending the indefensible, rose with a smirk. "Objection, Your Honor. My clients were following standard procedure." The judge didn't even glance at him. Overruled. "Proceed, Mr. Carter." Julian turned back to the jury, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the stand. "The defense will try to tell you this was standard procedure, that what you see in this video is nothing more than two officers doing their job." His voice hardened. "But let me ask you, when did it become standard procedure to strike a 72-year-old woman across the face? When did it become standard procedure to throw a disabled person from their wheelchair and laugh as they lay in pain?" He let the question hang in the air, the weight of it pressing down on every person in the room. These men acted not out of duty, but out of cruelty. And the moment they chose to put their hands on my mother, they violated not only her rights, but the very principles this country claims to stand for. Julian turned toward the judge. "The prosecution calls its first witness, Officer Richard Malone." There was a slight murmur in the crowd as one of the department's own took the stand. Officer Malone, a younger officer with tired eyes and the look of a man carrying a heavy burden, took his seat and raised his right hand. After being sworn in, he cleared his throat, his hands clasped together in his lap. Julian stepped forward. "Officer Malone, you were not present at the scene of the incident, correct?" Malone nodded. "No, sir. I was on duty elsewhere that day." "But you were made aware of what happened shortly afterward?" Another nod. "Yes, sir." Julian clasped his hands behind his back. "Tell me, Officer Malone, what was the general reaction in your department when news of this incident broke?" Malone hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "There were mixed reactions." "Explain," Julian pressed, his tone gentle but firm. Malone swallowed. "Some of us were disgusted. We knew it was wrong. We knew it would bring shame on the department. But there were others who—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Go on," Julian encouraged. Malone sighed. "There were others who said it was just bad optics, that if no one had recorded it, it wouldn't have been an issue." A ripple of outrage swept through the crowd. The judge banged her gavel. "Order in the court." Julian took a step closer. "So, you're telling me that some of your colleagues were less concerned about the brutality itself and more concerned about the fact that people saw it?" Malone nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir." Julian turned to the jury, letting that statement sink in before continuing. "Officer Malone, in your professional opinion, were the actions of the two officers that day justifiable?" Malone hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir. They weren't." "Thank you, officer." Julian nodded and turned to the defense. "Your witness." The defense attorney stood, buttoning his expensive suit jacket, and approached the witness with an oily smile. "Officer Malone, you weren't there that day, correct?" "That's correct." "So your entire testimony is based on second-hand accounts and opinions?" Malone stiffened. "No, sir. It's based on facts. The same facts the rest of the world saw on that video." The defense attorney's smirk faltered. He shifted tactics. "Tell me, officer, have you ever been in a high-stress situation where you had to make a split-second decision?" Malone narrowed his eyes. "Yes. And do you believe that sometimes officers have to use force to maintain control of a situation?" "Yes," Malone admitted. "But this wasn't one of those situations." The attorney pursed his lips, clearly annoyed that the officer wasn't falling into his trap. He dismissed him with a wave and sat back down. Julian stood again, his voice calm and controlled. "The facts of this case are undeniable. The brutality is on full display for the world to see. But what we must ask ourselves is this: what are we going to do about it?" He turned back to the jury, his final words ringing through the courtroom. "These men believed they could get away with their actions because they always have before. They counted on silence, on apathy, on a system that protects the powerful and punishes the weak. But today that ends. Today, we stand for justice." The room was silent as Julian returned to his seat, his mother's face flashing in his mind. This was for her, and he wasn't done yet. The verdict and the aftermath. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of ordinary silence that settles when people are waiting for something mundane, but the kind of silence that carried weight, a collective breath held in suspense, a moment stretched taut with expectation. Julian Carter sat at the prosecution's table, his fingers interlocked tightly, his jaw rigid with controlled tension. The trial had been long, grueling. Day after day, he had dissected the evidence, torn through the lies, and forced the world to see the truth. He had called on every witness necessary, introduced every piece of damning footage, and left no room for doubt. Now, it was time to hear whether justice would truly be served. Across from him, the two former officers sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable but their body language betraying them. They were nervous, as they should be, because for the first time in their careers, they weren't shielded by their badges. They weren't the ones in control. Today, they were the ones being judged. The judge, a stoic woman with piercing eyes and an air of authority, glanced toward the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A middle-aged man, the jury foreman, stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide everything. The entire room seemed to lean forward. "We have, Your Honor." His voice was steady, but the weight of his words could be felt by every person in the room. The judge gave a single nod. "Please read the verdict." The foreman unfolded the paper, cleared his throat, and read. "On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendants guilty." A rush of emotion surged through Julian's chest, but he remained outwardly calm. The collective gasp from the courtroom was quickly replaced with hushed murmurs, a mixture of relief and disbelief. The foreman continued, his voice unwavering. "On the charge of unlawful detainment, we find the defendants guilty." The murmurs grew louder. The former officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confident facades cracking under the weight of their downfall. "On the charge of misconduct and abuse of power, we find the defendants guilty." The words rang through the room like a bell of reckoning. The defense attorneys visibly tensed. One of them ran a hand down his face, already contemplating the appeals process, but the damage had been done. There was no coming back from this. The judge remained composed. "The defendants will be remanded into custody immediately. Sentencing will be scheduled within the next week." Julian finally allowed himself a slow exhale. He had won, not just for his mother, but for every person who had ever been told that justice was out of reach. One of the former officers, the stocky one, turned in his chair to glare at Julian. His face was red with anger, his pride too deep to allow him to accept the reality of what had just happened. "You ruined our lives," he spat, his voice low but seething. Julian met his gaze without flinching. "No," he said evenly. "You did that yourself." The bailiffs approached to take the men into custody, their hands now in the same cuffs they had once used on others without a second thought. As they were led away, the room slowly erupted into applause. It wasn't loud or wild, but it was full of meaning. Community leaders, activists, victims of police brutality, and ordinary citizens who had come to witness history, every single one of them understood what this moment represented. Justice, a rare and precious thing. Camille squeezed Julian's shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it." Julian simply nodded. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. Not yet, because while this battle was over, the war for justice was far from won. Outside the courthouse, the movement grows. As soon as Julian stepped outside, he was met with a sea of people. Protesters, supporters, families of victims who had never received justice. They were all there. The street was packed, the roar of voices swelling the moment they saw him. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. People held up signs that read "Justice for Milan," "No more police brutality," and "We will not be silent." A woman in her 50s approached him, her eyes filled with tears. "My brother was killed by the police 10 years ago," she said, her voice trembling. "They never even went to trial. But today, I feel like maybe things can change." Julian swallowed the lump in his throat. He wasn't just fighting for his mother. He was fighting for all of them. A microphone was thrust in front of him. "Mr. Carter, do you have a statement?" Julian took a deep breath and faced the crowd, his voice strong and steady. "This is just the beginning." He paused, letting the words settle. Today, justice was served. But justice should never be this rare. It should never take overwhelming public pressure, viral videos, and nationwide outrage just to hold people accountable. It should be the standard. The crowd cheered, their voices ringing out in agreement. "This case wasn't just about my mother," Julian continued. "It was about every black man and woman, every disabled person, every vulnerable citizen who has been targeted, harassed, or brutalized by those who swore to protect them. Today, we proved that the system can work, but we also proved that it is deeply broken." He met the eyes of as many people as he could, his voice carrying over the chants and applause. "So I ask all of you, what happens next?" He gestured toward the sea of people, their faces expectant and full of hope. "Do we let this be a single victory, Or do we make it the start of something bigger? The crowd erupted. Bigger, someone shouted. No more silence. Another voice called. Julian nodded. Then we keep fighting. We keep pushing. We demand accountability, not just in one case, but in every case. We demand laws that protect the people, not the abusers of power. We demand real change. His voice dropped lower, heavy with emotion. Because if we don't, then this moment is just a headline, and my mother's pain will have meant nothing. The crowd surged with renewed energy. They were ready. And so was he. 1 week later, a promise kept. Julian sat beside his mother in her living room, watching the evening news. The sentencing had been announced earlier that day. 10 years in prison for each officer, with the possibility of federal civil rights charges pending. A precedent had been set. Meline reached over and took her son's hand, squeezing it gently. You did good, Julian. Julian shook his head. We did good, Mom. She smiled, tired but full of pride. You know, I spent my whole life trying to be strong, trying to handle things on my own. But that day when I was on the ground, I was scared. Her voice softened. And then I heard you, and I knew everything was going to be okay. Julian swallowed hard, his grip tightening around hers. No one should ever have to go through what you did. Meline nodded. Then keep fighting. Julian looked at the television, where footage of the protests still played. The movement wasn't over. It had only just begun. And he would be there, every step of the way. For his mother, for his people, for justice.